What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Before I get into the subject matter at hand, I'd like to remind you guys always that if you want to donate to this channel, if you want to show love to Too Raw for TV, if you choose to, you can do so on the links provided in the description box. Now, this is a request video for one of my subscribers. His name is More Skittles. Now, More Skittles asked me, Too Raw, when you were a kid watching basketball, did you compare the players you were watching to the previous era? And I started watching basketball when I was about 9 years old. It was toward the end of the, I believe it was toward the end of the 89-90 season going to the playoffs when the Pistons eventually won the championship against the Portland Trailblazers. It was the last few months that CBS had the contract with the NBA. Afterward, it was the long-standing partnership between the NBA and NBC, which I think is the greatest era of basketball. I mean, first of all, the theme song, the John Tesh came up. Even before that, when you saw the NBA Peacock come up, you know, oh, I know, I'm taking you guys back to the NBA on NBC. We're coming from you live from sunny Los Angeles, California, with the Los Angeles Lakers versus the Detroit Pistons. Can Magic Johnson lead his injury-depleted squad against the defending NBA champion, the Detroit Pistons? Hi, I'm Marv Albert here with, you know what I'm talking about. But they made every game just seem like an absolute battle. And but getting to your question, did I compare players at that time to the? No, I didn't really do that because this is what I think the NBA has done a piss poor job of doing. I remember the NBA back then. You gotta remember, the '50s wasn't that long ago. Back in 1990, it was a while, but it wasn't that long ago. It was comparable to like how the let me see, let me get my bearings straight. Okay, the inception of the NBA was 1946. Well, it was called the BAA, but you know, generally speaking, that's considered the start of the NBA. 1990 was 44 years later. So that would be comparable to the late 70s now. So a lot of those guys most of those guys were still alive. Um, and also, the NBA, I thought, did a better job of honoring its history than it does now. The average fan, in my opinion, back then, was much more knowledgeable of NBA history than the average fan is today. And that's no knock on the fan of today. It's really a knock on the NBA, sports media, and what they focus on now, which is contemporary, sensationalism. Whatever is now is the best, is what is promoted, and history doesn't pay the bills. It's all about now. And that's why I think sports radio, sports media, they figured out that um, what generates a lot of traffic, what generates a lot of interest, is debate. We see it in politics. They took it from politics. Um, you had your debates back then. You know, you debated whether or not the best center of all time was Wilt Chamberlain or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I think back then it was more of a nod toward Chamberlain, but over the last 25 years, it's shifted to Abdul-Jabbar. Um, I also think that Oscar Robertson was viewed in a much higher light back then than he is now. There's some people who don't even see Oscar as a top 10 all-time player, as opposed to when I was growing up, he was the big O. He was the guy that averaged a triple-double for a season. He was a top 5 all-time player when I was growing up. Now some guys don't have him in their top 10. Some guys don't even have him in the top 15. I think the guy that's taking the biggest hit legacy wise is Elgin Baylor. Elgin Baylor, when I was growing up, now we all know Elgin Baylor unfortunately did not win a championship during his career. But one thing that Elgin Baylor should be noted for is the fact that Elgin Baylor helped save the Lakers franchise. After the era of George Mikan, Vern Mickelson, Slater Martin, Jack Pollard, uh, that team held by the late great John Cundler. Um, After that team had its course, the Minneapolis Lakers went through a period of time where they were terrible. They were hemorrhaging money, and it was to the point where if they weren't able to get a marquee name, that franchise would have folded. There would have been no more Lakers franchise. This is when they were in Minneapolis, but they were able to sign a young, bright phenom named Elgin Baylor. I think he was playing at what was then Seattle University. I think that's what the name of it is. I don't think they exist anymore. But when I signed Elgin Baylor, he was the most exciting NBA player. He was the premier scorer in the NBA before the ascension of Wilt Chamberlain, and he helped to save that franchise. He was like the Michael Jordan of his day. Now, this gets lost today because people don't know about their history. Now, some of this has just come from my own personal research. Like I said, I love researching history. I love finding out things. I try to find out something new every day. But I don't think that fans today have much of an interest in history, you know. But I also, like I said, I don't remember them constantly criticizing or comparing eras. What I do remember, though, is some of the older players I've mentioned, like a Will Chamberlain, like a Bill Russell, like an Oscar Robertson, definitely Oscar Robertson. I do remember them being more critical of the 90s players, the players themselves from that time. They were more critical of the players that I grew up watching, you know, and the era that I grew up watching. In particular, the mid to late 90s. They thought that that brand of basketball was watered down. Now, I'm not going to lie, I used to get offended by that. You know, I was offended by that because I thought it was unfair to criticize the brand of basketball I grew up watching. So that's why when I listen to you guys and I hear you say, too raw, you're being too hard on the era of basketball, sometimes I take a step back and I have to reassess myself and check myself because maybe I'm doing the same things that they're doing. You know what I'm saying? It does offend me when people call me a hater. That's why I get so offended by that because I try to be as objectionable as possible most of the times. There are times when I get mad and I might do a video and I'm, you know, going off on some shit because I'm pissed off and I'm human. But generally speaking, unless we're talking about the Patriots, and of course I'm a true blue hater of the greatest extreme, and I'm not going to apologize for that. But I try to be objective. But they thought that the brand of basketball in the mid to late 90s was watered down. They thought it was too many teams. I remember hearing there were too many teams. They said that the guys were overpaid, and if I was playing or the competition I was playing with were playing in this league, it would be a joke. I thought that, but at the same time, I respected Wilt Chamberlain's opinion. I respected Bill Russell's opinion. For the most part, I respected Oscar Robertson's opinion, but I did not respect his criticism of Jordan because I thought it was unfair. But for the most part, I respected those guys' opinions because they were legends. They knew the game of basketball better than I would ever have known at that age, and still do. So I respect their opinion. I just disagreed. So, that's some of the differences I've noticed. I think that today's fans are a lot more disrespectful of the past eras than my generation was when in regards to the past eras. That's something I have noticed. Like there's very little respect from younger fans when it comes to earlier eras, in particular before the 1980s. They think that that was garbage basketball. They said the guys couldn't dribble, even though they don't realize that uh, palming the basketball was called much more uh, liberally, much more liberally, and traveling was called much more liberally than it is today. Like the dribble moves that we see Kyrie Irving and Allen Iverson and Gilbert Arenas and all these guys doing, you couldn't do that back in the 60s. So that's why the guys dribbled the way they did. Um, you go on to say, I'm trying to figure out why the media constantly shits on the old school era of the NBA. It's just the fact that you got younger guys playing now, and younger guys who aren't of the old NBA establishment. They only have seen the NBA probably since the 90s. So they look at the old grainy footage that's slowed down and they just see something that's old and obsolete and they just dismiss it, you know what I'm saying, without taking into account the rule changes and other things that were affecting the game back then. So that's just part of it, you know. He also said, also, if you pay attention, have you noticed the NBA never markets or talks about the defense in the 80s or 90s? Well, they do talk about the defense in the 90s. I disagree about the 1990s, but I do agree about the 1980s. They tend to refer to the 1980s as the run and gun 1980s. They talk about the Denver Nuggets. They talk about the Los Angeles Lakers. You know, but defense. There was something that Gilbert Arenas said in a podcast that I saw yesterday. He was talking to Lou Williams on his podcast, and it's something I disagree with him totally. And I'm going to talk about uh, that in great detail in another video. He was saying that the players of yesteryear weren't skilled. That's bullshit. That's bullshit. You know, the NBA, in my opinion, was at its most talented in the 1980s. The reason why the scores were so high is because every team, like, look, when you think about it, how many super teams were there in the NBA back in the 1980s? When I say super teams, I mean more than uh, two stars, multiple. The Boston Celtics, the Los Angeles Lakers, the Detroit Pistons, right? The Philadelphia 76ers will have a name there. The Denver Nuggets, the Portland Trailblazers. Now, Michael Jordan didn't really have another superstar until Scottie Pippen, which is why he was losing because he was going against all these teams. Remember, there were only 23 teams when Michael came in the league, not 30. So he was playing against superior competition more often. You know, it was all these different teams that had at least 2 to 3 superstars. So you had all of these guys who went to college and were able to polish their games. You didn't have a guy shooting 45% from the free throw line. There was a fucking perimeter player, point guard, like Lonzo Ball. You had these skilled, polished guys. You had these great shooters coming out of college then, okay? And the Sonics is another team that pops up in my mind that had multiple stars. Remember, at one point they had Xavier McDaniel, uh, Dale Ellis, and Tom Chambers. Tom Chambers put up 27 points per game. McDaniel putting up 24 points a game. You had Dallas putting up 25, 26 points per game. But this gets lost in NBA history. Um, so you had all these great offensive teams, but you also had great defensive stoppers in that era. You know what I'm saying? And that gets lost. People talk about the offense, but you had these great defensive stoppers. You had Alvin Robertson. You had Michael Jordan, of course, was a great defensive player. Later on, Scottie Pippen in the decade. You had T.R. Dunn. You had David Roundfeld with the Atlanta Hawks. Joe Dumars, Dennis Rodman, Rick Mahorn, John Sally, the whole fucking Pistons team, you know, Derek McKee, Michael Cooper, you know, Dennis Johnson, you know, Gus Williams. I mean, you had all of these guys who were great on the defensive end. Sidney Moncrief. So you know what I'm saying? It was a great, complete league. By the mid 1990s, there was a slip in overall talent in the NBA. You had a couple of more franchises added by then. You had the Toronto Raptors, you had the Memphis Grizzlies. Earlier on, of course, you had the Charlotte Hornets, the Miami Heat, the Minnesota Timberwolves, Orlando Magic. So with that expansion, that did kind of dilute the talent a little bit from some of the teams. But it still was a really good league. But the 80s does get slept on as far as defense is concerned. And of course, the rule changes. You know, you had guys getting clothesline, going to the going to the basket. Excuse me. Today that would be a flagrant run. One, you know, that was just routine back then. You had hand checking still, you know, in effect, even though technically it was eliminated in 1978 or 79, but they didn't really they really didn't get rid of it until starting in the mid 90s and eventually altogether by the mid 2000s. But it was a much different league, man. And you know, for Gilbert Arenas to sit there and say that, you know, but you know, Gilbert is Gilbert. You know what I'm saying? And you said the NBA never talks about the bad boy Pistons. You don't even see them in the highlights they do from that era. It's almost like they never existed. I think the Pistons were not part of the plan. The Pistons were not part of the plan as far as teams they want to promote. They want to promote the grace and style and the fluidity of the Showtime Lakers, or the grit and hustle and the hard hat mentality of the Boston Celtics. But they didn't want to promote the bad boy Pistons because they were, I mean, I hate this, it's the only way I could put it, but they were ghetto. They were thuggish. They were thugs. You know what I'm saying? They were bully ball. You know, like get your ass, get the fuck out of here. You know what I'm saying? They would fucking come down here with that shit. You know, it was bully ball to the point where you had dudes led by Michael Jordan, who was as competitive as anybody that ever played the game, complaining to the league about how they were playing. So when you had all these powerful entities against one team, you know, you got to wonder whether or not there was a conspiracy to get rid of that team. Because it's kind of funny how they did have all of these new teams, like I said, by the late 80s, and through the expansion draft, they kind of diluted that Piston team. You know, ultimately, Rick Mahorn went to the Philadelphia 76ers. John Sally went to the Heat, you know, and ultimately, you know, injuries and age started affecting the team a little bit. So, because of what the Pistons represented, the reputation that a guy like Isaiah Thomas had, you know, they don't talk about that Piston team in the way they should have. But you can make the argument, man, that if it wasn't for Isaiah Thomas's, I don't like doing this woulda, coulda, shoulda shit too much, but you can make the argument if it wasn't for Isaiah Thomas's uh, hurting his ankle in '88, you can make the argument that they should have three-peated. They came damn near close to winning the finals in '88. They won in '89. They won it in '90. And if Isaiah Thomas doesn't get hurt in 1991, other injuries affecting the club, and it wasn't for the dilution of the team through the draft, you know, as far as expansion, you got to wonder what that team could have been like. They won two championships in a row, but they potentially could have been a dynasty. But I think a lot of people felt like the way they played basketball was not representative of what they wanted to promote for the league. But that's just my opinion. Tell me what you guys think about it.